coast of Norway, it looks pretty much like this. And how do you deal with that? And also, in particular, when the regulations are decided in Oslo, and when you're dealing with this kind of landscape. So, what are then the future planning challenge in Norway? And we're dealing also in Norway with climate change, because you get heavy storms and the flooding problem, and particularly because of the glaciers are melting, and you have heavy rainfalls, and either you have very hot or very cold summers. So either you have summers of 34 degrees up to the north, or you have summers of 8 degrees and rain. So that is, and it happens, you never know how the summer will be. And also the other thing is like this high number of private car ownership and the car dependency. It's really growing, and it has also to do with individual lifestyles in Norway, the lonely wolf image. And also what you see in Norway, you see a population increase in cities, but it declines in the rural areas. And the last thing is like the urban tradition is very little in Norway, and people are moving into cities, so they have to say we have to densify the cities, but also how to plan well-functioning and lively urban areas in towns and city centers. So if you just look at the situation of Norway at the GDP and population growth, if you see the dark green, a really very high amount of GDP per inhabitants, and as you see it's really low in Eastern Europe and towards Russia. You see particularly the west coast, it's really high in Norway. So it's a quite wealthy country. And here you see with population growth, the blue here, it's like the population are increasing in the larger cities. Here is Oslo, here is Kristiansand, Stavanger, the oil city of Norway, and then you have Bergen, and you have Trondheim, and then up in the north you have some cities there where people are moving from rural areas into cities. So that is the situation. What I will focus on is in Bergen, to use an example, how do you deal with it, and which is the most rainy city in Europe. And here you see the city, the historical part, and then you see a part built around 1900 or expanded here, and after the Second World War you get this sprawl into, and then you have a lot of these single family houses. And what we have to deal with is like you have 2 meter rain per year. That is what you have to deal with. There's the most famous image of Bergen, the Bergen, which is where nearby the fishing market. And that you have to deal with. And also you have to deal with 200 days of rain per year. You see this tourist image, which is taken from one of the hills. Most of the year, that is the view you get from that. So that is the reality, what you have to deal with. That is what you see in the tourist brochures. And also like this kind of photos, when you have nice weathers, and there are not many of them. So here you see the city from the other side. You see here the Atlantic Ocean, some of the islands, and then you see the big mountains around, the 7 mountains, where all the rain are squeezed out and goes into this city. And here I will talk about, and the structure of the presentation. I will short tell you about the background, what made the planning in Norway as it is today. Just a short history of planning in Norway. Then I'll tell you how is the structure of the present planning system. And then I will discuss the challenge what they're dealing, how are they solved with the present planning system. And then I will show you some planning examples. I will always show Bergen during the whole presentation. We go very long back in history. You see that the position of Norway, and particularly Bergen, it has to do with this kind of, during the Viking period. And I always say that Christopher Columbus discovered America, but they say that Eivind Raufoss, one of the Vikings, he drove to Iceland, Greenland, and came to Vinland. So that is, they call it Vinland, that was the America they discovered in this period. And also they did a lot of shipping and trading, and also of course they were when when you go to town to take the gold.
Everything.
Yeah, so they were like, that's the way how they get the richness, and it had a period in that time, and that's because of very high quality of the ships building, so they can cross over larger oceans, and they have been reconstructing the ships, and it worked very fine, so there are a couple of them still active just for fun. And what happened around 1100, Norway got also Christianized, and you have some artifacts from that period where you have the Norwegian state churches, which have a lot of ornaments from the Viking gods period. But I think you have about 50 of them in Norway that still exist, and so that is. But if you look at some of the kings at that period, they start also to make planning and building laws, and that is they have a rule about the street width, and also the location of the market, and the location of some functions. He made some rules they've written down, and these rules were implemented in some of the cities, but very late, at about 1600. But he wrote that rule, but the road width was really made. They had to make they go with the whole horse, and they had a sort of piece of wood, and they said the road had to be that width, so at least that some horses can cross each other. So that is only law they had at that time from 1260. So here you see the plan of Trondheim. For those who've been in Trondheim, that the pattern of the city has followed the rules from Magnus Lagabøte's law from 1200 and something. So, but what happened in Norway, it was really growing, but then you get what you call the disease that killed half of European population around 1300, and Norwegian has the name Svartedauden, the Black Death, and it killed 65% of the Norwegian population, but in some village 90% of the population died. So you can read in all books about there were 300 inhabitants and there were only 3 left. So that is, you see, and then you get this term, you have a lot of Norwegian surname called Ødegård, and that is like left farm. So it's a farm that is nobody lives there. So that, and that affected really the whole country. And somehow in 1400 there was a marriage between kings and queens. You know, first the Norwegian king married a Danish queen, and they get only one son, and he married a Swedish queen, and then you have the Scandinavian Union. You had the union between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. But somehow it ended up that Norway was for 400 years under Danish administration. And here you see a marriage of one of the prince with one of the princess, and then they get only one child. So it was really sort of very little was going on for 400 years. And it was a very rural country with hunting and fishing and some agriculture production. Small cities, you have some, there was Oslo, Bergen, doing some trade, Stavanger, Trondheim, Kristiansand, Tromsø, and Tønsberg. They were really, and the export was ships building and timber and fish. And also here, like, it was only 3% of the Norwegian surface is used for agriculture, and the rest is rocks and stones. And most of the agriculture areas are in the south of Norway. In the north is very difficult because the summer can last for a couple of days. So here is one of an early drawing. What was Bergen like? I think it is around 1600. So it was a sort of trading city. In some period it was also the capital of Norway. And here you see that famous fishing market. So it was very dense populated, wooden buildings, and they were very, very closely located. And you see also during the Hansa period, around 1540, Bergen had also very strong trade role in this period. So while everything else was very dominated by Danish administration, Bergen and the west coast, they were living their own life because it was very difficult for a Danish taxman to get the tax in, because of very poor accessibility due to mountains, fjords, and you had to cross the fjords by boats, and people were living up in high hills. So that was the situation. And in Bergen, of course, because people were living very dense, we had a lot of city fires. In total, has been 33 of them. That really the city burned down several times. Here you see also first plan where they start to think about making wider streets. So if a fire breaks out in one urban block, then the others will not be affected. So normally when it started, either was that part or that part disappeared. So that was the plan, and that was the situation at the moment for the city. So here you see the harbor and the fishing market. Very, very dense. That was the situation. In 1814, Norway got their own constitution law. That is called Grunnlov, and the ground law, translated directly to the. There were a lot of movement going on. You had the national romanticism, so there was a lot of activities in writing and paintings, where you start to paint typical Norwegian motifs, fjords, mountains. They write poems, and here is the painting from the day when they published or that the constitution law was accepted in Eidsvoll, which is about 70 kilometers north of Oslo. So that was the constitution law. There's one paragraph from this law which is very relevant to planning in Norway, and that's the paragraph 105. And that says, to translate very to English, no one should be taken away the property. So that is very strong, and so that strong property right has always been there, and that has influenced the planning practice a lot. Because when you build a road, you need to remove some buildings or take away property. You have the expropriation law, but the ground law is dominating about that.
I have a question.
Yeah?
I don't understand what no one should be taken away from their own property, you say?
No, that the state claim take away the property. If you own a piece of land and the state
expropriate.
Yeah, expropriate. So that was like because you were a lot of revolutions going on in France, and so that they put in the law like nobody should be taken away the property. If you own it's your property, then it's yours. That is very strong. Then around 1850, it happened, start to really happen things in Norway. In the 1750, you have the Industrial Revolution in Britain. But something started to happen in Norway, sort of paradigm shift in the way of planning or doing things. So here you see an air photograph of Bergen, here you see Bergen. You see this very high density of wooden houses. And it started, there's a lot of societal changes that start in the 19th century. You have population growth, but also the city fires, because people move into cities and start to build more denser, and of course it burn down. And then you have the industrialization process, but also the sort of liberalization of the economy. And all these things, this industrial revolution, they started first of all to do large infrastructure project where they built this railway connection from Oslo to Bergen, and I think it cost a couple of state budgets, and they really did that. And you see that was, you see some old images, you have to struggle with heavy snowfalls, but it works today, and the highest point is at 1,222 meters. And you also had to consider the strong winters there. So that is still working today, but that was a really, really big project to connect Bergen to Oslo. And also most of the year, in the winter months, so it happened that for 6 months that the road connections between Oslo and Bergen is closed, so you have to travel all the way around to get to Oslo. And that's also still the case. So by heavy snowstorms, the roads are blocked. What also happened with the industrial revolution in Norway, it was not that big if you compare with other countries, but they start to do a lot of export of wood, fish, and and ships. They were very active in ships building at that time. So here you see Bergen. This is the historical center here. On the back side, all the factories and all these industrial buildings start to appear. And of course, people move into the city, they start to work, so there was something going on. But somehow in the 30s, then it was a change going on in society, because then you have the labor movement, and also because a lot of people move into the city, they start to incorporate in the planning that we have to improve the health and living conditions for the poor, and particularly for the working class people. So there was something going on in the 30s. And of course, when you look at the first planning laws, they were first dealing with technical issues, but also with fires. So before we got over a national planning and building law, every city, a big city, had their own planning law. Oslo had several. Bergen got one in 1830 after a very, very big city fire, and Trondheim in 1841. And the rest had a law, and it is Old Norwegian, that means translated law considering the building council. So that's from 1845. And then in 1896, then Norway got the first national plan and building law. And most of it has to deal with the city fires. So it means like within a certain area, there was forbidden to use timber. You need to use brick. So that is what they started to do. And also they make a requirement that every city should make a plan. So how do we expand? And also how do we make healthy cities? Like you have wider streets, and also like the quality of the living condition are good, that you have proper dwellings. And that very strong influence from Europe, and that's that orthogonal grid plan. And that were the rules of streets and blocks, was following much this orthogonal grid plan, and was designed mostly by engineers. Here in Bergen, it had now total 33 city fires, and there was a big city fire in 1702, and then they start to make this wide street, and they have a street name they call Allmenninger, and it means like public space movement routes, you can translate it. And it's only you see it in Bergen, this word. It's a typical Bergen word. And then I can see how this big city fire, you see how much of the city center were affected. And also, effect of a city fire, here you see Bergen. Here you see the really old wooden building, and they start to implement this kind of plan, very influenced by the orthogonal grid. So you can see it on this picture, what were the effect. Here you see these old tiny buildings, and here you see the new buildings, what started, what was implemented at the second half of 1850. I can show you the street inside the old historical part. You can see it's very narrow. So when you get the fire, it seems like the rest are affected. And here you see also, because of this strong property right in Norway, but when you had so many city fires, and also the cost involved with that, that's where you see a sort of more large-scale planning in Norway. Here they introduced this kind of this kind of orthogonal grid plan. It's like a plan for rebuilding the city after a fire. So you see that a lot before 1900. Here you see also this Allmenninger. So they introduced some wide called public street, but they had the purpose also to make sure that the fire does not jump over to the next neighborhood. So that were this kind of example. What also happened after 1900, because the city grew very fast, then they start to expand. Here you see the city center, and then they expand to the Nygård area. Here you see the first factories appearing. And then also, you see this is the historical part, and suddenly this part was built out, this part, and this part. You see this chess plan, it's very the development followed much the orthogonal grid. It was just imposed, even though the city is very hilly. And here you see some other plans for rebuilding the city. There you see the water, there the historical city center, and here the area today followed much this plan. And here you see outside the city center, because it's so hilly, so there they make a plan for further expansion. Here is the city center, and it goes further out there. And it followed much the plan today. And here was a professor called Herman Jansen, and he wrote, here's an area that had yet another fire around 1905, and he wrote very clearly that we need to make proper fire plans, because the cost of implementing them are much cheaper than rebuilding a city after a fire. So he wrote that, and he said that waste of 8 to 10 million kroner that can still be saved. We are talking about prices that were extremely high about 1905. If you now look at all the laws before 1945, in 1924 it came a new building law, and they said we had to remove this very strict orthogonal grid because it's not suitable for the Norwegian landscape, in particular at the west coast. They had made it more or less a requirement in the first building law. At the same time, around 1940, the war started with Germany, and a lot of cities in the whole coast of Norway, northern Norway, get burned down. And already from 1940, they start to make a plan they call brente steders regulering. It's mean the burn down places regulations. So how to deal, we have to have the plan ready before when the war is finished, so we can have something to build a city. They make these plans, and here you see some examples, a town called Steinkjer, which was completely burned down in the Second World War. And there you see the new plan, how it's rebuilt. And here you see some drawings, which was made around 1940. So that was the situation. After the Second World War, it was really because of all the city fires. Bergen was not affected by city fire due to the war. But most, when you go north, from northwest country, the whole coast up to the Russian border, all the big places get burned down in the Second World War. And it has also to do with the threat from Russia. It was a sort of, they had a very strategic location. So it means that a lot of people who were homeless in the north, they were living in caves and so on, and the winters can be cold, so they all went to Oslo. So what happened, that the city had to deal with, or most big cities had to deal to make big plans. How do we handle expansion? People are moving to the larger cities. So there were two leading architects who did urban design, and that was Harald Hals and Sverre Pedersen, and they mostly make plans in Oslo. And then also the functionalist movement started to come to Norway, that form follow functions. And that was also a very cheap way to solve the dwelling shortage in cities, that you implement this very much Le Corbusier-inspired high-rise buildings. First of all, they start to make overall plans of Oslo, and here you see the grey areas and the black areas. That were the areas that people were living. And then they started to make plans for expansion. Where do they put the housing? And of course, agriculture ground is very scarce in Norway, so you have to keep them. But this was the urbanization pattern that we were planning. And of course, the planned recreation route is also in between. So there was one architect from the planning department. He was asked to go for a whole winter cross-country skiing and then mark where the nicest ski routes, so people everywhere from the center can easily go cross-country skiing in the winter month. They start also to make big overall plans in Bergen. Here is that historical area of Bergen. And here you see around a lot of high mountains. So they're very difficult to build on it. So they have to start to think, how do we expand further out to other areas where it's built. And they start to make a big plans. These are new, they have to upgrade and make new roads and tunnels, and that much of the road network in Bergen is following this plan, except this one, because it's really, this is not built, and it goes through a really important recreation areas. I think this is the drink water reservoir in Bergen, so that was like, we're not going to build that link. And here you see also they make the sort of the big center plan. This is the center of Bergen, and we make some suburbs here. And of course we have this idea from the functionalists, the influence from Europe also came up to the north. So this kind of light view, green areas, like healthy dwelling areas. And of course they had also a plan. Here you see the historical part of Bergen, and we're planning to tear down all the buildings and start to build really high-rise buildings in the center with a lot of green areas in between. But that plan was never implemented in Bergen Center, but it went further out. Here you see the city center, here you see this kind of houses. So the first really sort of social housing suburb started in the 1950s, 1960s in the area called Landås. It means countryside hill. So it was outside of the city. So that the first expansion start. And of course, in the 1950s, the oil adventure start. And it means like the oil was discovered in the North Sea, and therefore they established the oil fund. And that was really a long-term, how do you can use the money so they last for future generations. So they established the oil fund. And of course, that affected also a lot of new jobs in oil, building oil platforms. So it gave enormous economic growth to the country, and also the welfare state was established. And also these demographic changes that even more people start to move from the countryside into the bigger cities. In the 1960s and 1961, the private car ownership was free. Before you had to apply to have a car, and you need to argue why do we need it. From 1961, everybody who could afford it, they bought a car. And that somehow really was useful to support the Norwegian individual lifestyle. And that contributed that you get the single family houses with large gardens, and that spread really out of the suburbs and further out of the cities. So, and also in the 1950s of the 70s, that was also the period when Norway made big plans. How do we manage growth? It's a plan from Bergen from 1972. They say, okay, here we make this the urban center of Bergen. Here we make a new center, it's the airport. And around here, we can urbanize these areas. And all these gray areas that are hills that are higher than 200 meters. And we are talking about more extreme weather. If you live about 200 meters, then you have to deal with more rough weather. So you see that the hills obstacle to get us more compact city. And here also they already make a plan in the 70s for a light rail in Bergen to connect these areas. But the implementation of it, the first one started in 2010. So after a very long period. And here also they start already to discuss, here we have how do we make a center structure. So that they make like very roughly indication where do we plan new centers. But mostly they were much, I call it here, shopping malls in these areas. Here we plan big shopping malls for the suburbs. So you get a lot of houses like this built in the 70s, just put it random in the landscape, and you get the sort of very strange areas. And then on the other hand, in the 1980s, they say, no, we want to have low-rise buildings, because if you were lucky to live on the shadow side of these high buildings, the high flats, because the sun is very low and the shadows are long, so that could create really some very uncomfortable areas. So they start to build low-rise, but still very suburban living, like a sort of small neighborhood, very how to say, very local enclaves, and there's no mixture of visitors coming in there, so they tend to be very segregated. What also happened in the 70s and the 80s, in the beginning of the 90s, they started also to make business parks outside the city center. And what it really contributed to urban sprawl in Bergen. And you see that the black areas are land use for Bergen center, and then you see here the around Bergen center, it was, you see it also decreasing. But if you look at the outer areas, the land use for low sprawl, like low density urban sprawl, that was increasing. And this situation, around 2000, they realized we had to do something about it. In the 1990s, the concept sustainable development came on the agenda, and of course it was led by the Gro Harlem Brundtland, an old Norwegian Prime Minister, made this famous Brundtland report. But how do you do it in practice? That was a really problem. So here they have a sort of slogan, bærekraftig byutvikling. It means sustainable city development. And what to start with, we have to concentrate everything one in this valley. And then we have to make a light rail here. We have to follow that line. And up to now, this link is already built. It was the first part was finished in 2010 up to here, and last year it was finished here to a place called Lagunen, which means the lagoon. So that was the situation, and they say we need to densify along this line. And here we have some old industrial areas. We need to densify them, to intensify them. So suddenly this density policy start to come on the agenda. That's a strategy for Bergen municipality. And it means like already here you see the very old industrial areas, and then they start to build really high-rise office building here on the backside of the city center. And here you see the light rail, it's going right through and ends up in the center here. So that was the first strategy. And Bybanen, it means like the light rail, the city rail. It's already built. This part was finished from here last year, so it opened. And they said, okay, maybe we should make a sort of linear city. Here's the historical center. We follow that principle. And also, like, we need to densify along this light rail. What happened during the last 4 or 5 years, the property prices start to increase around that, and also they start to do very high density, a sort of local center urban projects along the most important stations. And here you have a plan for the end station for the Lagunen to build really high density. At the moment, it's one big shopping mall with really, really large parking space. It's a really car-dependent environment. So they hope that maybe when the light rail, now it's open, that it's possible to build really high density to make a local center. But if you see around here, this is the typical Norwegian urbanization pattern. Everybody wants to have a single family house with their own garden. That is what you have to deal with. And since 1965, it's been a lot of revisions of the building law, the planning and the building law. You have the planning and building law from 1965. Then they start to incorporate the economical aspect in the physical or spatial planning. So you have to deal, how do you do with economic growth? How do you deal it? How do you do with health service? That start to be a part of in the planning. Then you get the planning and building law from 1985. That is when I started to work in the municipality. There was more planning for the society. Like, how do you make good quality urban areas or housing areas? How do you facilitate where you locate the schools? All this thing work. And how do you do service for elderly homes? Everything was more planning for the society. It came a new planning and building law from 2008. And it was very influenced by the participation in planning. So you had a lot of this movement, so it was incorporated in the law that everybody who are involved, they can participate in the planning process, which means that it's really a time-consuming process. And also, they start to say we need accessibility for the disabled. So it means like you have, when you make a pedestrian road or pavement, it should not be steeper than 5 degrees. But the problem at the west coast is so hilly, you have several roads that are 10 degrees, go really straight up. So that's a really big problem. And then of course, they started to do with the 100-meter protection belt from coastal areas, because a lot of coastal areas in Norway are privatized by cottage and so on. So they want to make things accessible for everyone. That was the latest law. But you also have to deal with other laws relevant for planning, and that is all written in Norway. One is protection of biological diversity, culture, heritage. Of course, the law of expropriation, where you have to really deal with this ground law, paragraph 105. Protection of water, 5 minutes, and the beach law. And then you have now at the moment, if you look at the current structure of the planning system in Norway, the municipality make the plans, the provincia make the strategic plan, who make the policies for the whole region or the province, and of course the government give the national directions of what we should do. So, but most planning activities is made in the municipality, and here are the different types of plan you have to deal with. You have the land use plan and the societal plan, and then of course you have all this detailed regulation plan. This is the overall land use plan, where you highlight where you put new areas for expansion or densifying, or a new housing area for park. And here you see how are the land and the water even used, if it's drinking water, or is it the recreation water, or water for fish when you make salmon, you make dealing with the salmon production. And then of course on the local level you have more the legal plans, where you have a regulation plan, and you make description how high are you allowed to build, and what are the functions, if it's dwelling or shops. But the problem what you have in Norway, they start to make national policies. And you have the one for where you coordinate transport and land use planning, and the other is for densifying. But they have no idea how do you densify, because the planning practice in Norway is very incremental. They have many big visions, but few concrete solutions. You have the strong property right, big urban traditions, and so forth. And they are still looking to Europe. How do you make good solutions? And the problem is in Norway, they put a lot of money. They're very good in large-scale construction work in underwater technology, but when it comes to urban planning, it happens very incremental, and the property owners, they have the strongest saying. Here's one in Straume, a small municipality from 1960 to 2004, and it was very car dependent, and the challenge was here, how do we make a strategic plan so we can make more linking the areas to each other, like from a recreation through the shopping center and get to the center. And that needed a lot of participation in planning to get everybody to agree on that plan. And here you see the solution, what they finally come out to, and here you see the final plan to make a sort of access routes to make it easy for pedestrians. Now we go back to the rain problem in Bergen. Here you see a map for 24 hours, how much millimeter what can fall down on various areas in Bergen. And here you see a sort of rainfall per month. You see down here, you see Bergen and Trondheim, but you see the high column, you see Bergen. You see that it's really, really a thing you have to deal with. And it's been a lot of flooding in 2013 and 2014. Here's another flooding, what happened into the areas that the rivers really get over flooded. So it means that, and much can be causes that they close rivers and they build up on, and then the water comes over. So I said that we need to open all the small rivers. You have to make space for water into the planning. So here they start already to make solutions. How do you deal in the urban design with the surface water? And also in the city plans, you need to make space for water, otherwise it's a really big problem. So here are some important rivers, and here you see how do the water come from the hills down to the city. And here we have a hill that's about 300 meters above, and somehow the water need to get the roots through parks and also between houses to get down into the fjord. So here you see also you need to make what you call the blue and the green infrastructure, and the green infrastructure functions as a way of taking the water. And the last challenge what you have in Norway is how do you plan a public pedestrian-friendly street? How do you plan urban spaces? There's no tradition in that. And also the planning in Norway has been very much single-minded space use. Like here you have business areas, housing areas, shopping areas. And also this kind of separation of pedestrian and car traffic movement has the main movement routes very complex. And the private car has dominated most of the way how the solutions are made. And also you have few old urban areas in Norway. So it means like you have to protect what you have. This is Bergen in the past, and that is how it is today. And you see that the private car is dominating a lot. And I'm just going to skip this one. And it was a newspaper for half a year ago. They had the question, what do we want with our city? That is what they say. What do we want to do with it? And so here they have some plans. How do you remove the car? And how do you make a nice urban street for people? I'm going to skip this one. Here are some examples of what I've been doing. That is the main Allmenning in Bergen, the most important one. That is how it was in the 1980s, and that is how it is today. So this is the main urban space in Bergen. Here's a view from my home, and that was an old photo from the 80s, and that is called the party place, where you have concerts. There was a car park, and that is how it is today. So they are starting to move the car's accessibility from the city center. And the last one, I will show that you have what you call the ugly part of Bergen I talk about, and that is here in the city center. Here you have a big parking garage, shopping mall, railway station. You see like a lot of space not optimal used, and it's not nice to walk there. It's really car dominated. It's still like this today, and that's for the have to deal on the one hand. You have to deal with water because it's the lowest part of the center, and also you have to deal with pedestrian accessibility. So here they said that this is a very important route where pedestrians walk, but also here you have to deal with recreation and also the water drainage problem that it comes from the hill. You need to make a water, the way for the water. And here you see the final solution, what they made. So here you see you need to open up for the water, and also you made they're trying to make some urban blocks and like traditional urban streets, which make it more pedestrian friendly. Here you see an image what it is today. Like from here, when you walk there, it's really, really difficult for pedestrians to walk there. And here you see the solution what they propose. So open up a canal and link that water to the fjord. That is what it is. So to come to the conclusion in Norway, at the moment, because of all the changes, the urgent need for land use planning in Norway. Really, and they have to deal first with the property right issue. So a part of the education system is that you have to know how do you do with property rights, and how do you handle it, how do you negotiate with the stakeholders. The other thing you have to deal with is surface water management and the flooding problem. That is a very important part. That's the technical part of the education. And also the other, because access for all. How do you deal with road and street structure in an extreme hilly landscape? That's also, and also, how do you deal also with heavy snowfalls? Because the snow needs to be cleaned away also. How do you make space for it? That's the word you. And also this negotiation and communication of involved stakeholders. That's a very important part in the education. Because 90% of the regulations plan are proposed by private parties. So you function a lot as a negotiator, because those who own the property, they take the initiative for planning. So that's why planning is very incremental in Norway. And also, in urban areas, how do you propose integrated spatial solutions? How do you do with the water thing? How do you do with the pedestrian things? How do you make cities in such a way that it promotes sustainable transport means? Also, like in Norway, they start to incorporate the bicycle. So that's also a thing that has to come in planning. So that was my presentation.